Hi everyone. Yeah, really glad to see everyone here. I hope you had a good week. If you're still in the course, it means that you decided to stick with it after census date. So because it's week 5 now. So, congrats. We're hoping to get your assignment 1 marks back either this, well, probably not this Friday because some tutors are a bit slower than the others, but probably by Monday next week or something like that. So that should be good. That should be fun. And again, hopefully I'm getting my MBN tomorrow. So last streaming, pray. Now, in terms of today, as I mentioned on the forum, as a bunch of you have seen on the forum, I made a post which said that the week 5 lecture is typically kind of allowed for this like assignment 2 help lecture. Just like week 7's kind of getting started with React and assignment 2, week 8's like assignment 2 help. So I put up this post about lecture requests. We got a few responses and we should be able to run through a lot of those today. And yeah, we're pretty much just going to we're going to just look at assignment 2 from where we left off last week. We'll try and explore some of these topics, particularly around promises. And then we'll finish when we finish, kind of thing, if that makes sense. Is everyone here too? I noticed that we have 19 people. Now, naturally, it's going to be lower because everyone's aware that this isn't like a core lecture. So if people are feeling like they haven't done anything or they've done so much on assignment 2, they're not going to be here. But does someone want to just say hi in the chat so I know that, there's people here somewhere? Make sure that's all good. Make sure I haven't missed anything massive by accident. Maybe the chat's there. Sorry, let me refresh. Sometimes a thing happens where YouTube's chat doesn't work. Or you're just quiet today. Looks like you're all just quiet. Okay. Are people here in the chat? We're going to have to ask some questions. Horde, Jai, Rory, hi. Or are they all coming through suddenly now? Okay. I don't know. All right, well, let's get stuck into it. So the few kind of key themes that came up from me looking through your questions and everything else with assignment 2 was how do we deal with avoiding nesting when it comes to promises? How do we deal with maybe like having custom returns for like a chain of promises? And then there were just some questions around await async. So we should be able to tackle those relatively easily. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pull up the assignment 2 code that we were working on last week. So we'll just start from there, which is useful because, if you're watching this lecture back to back as well, it should be relatively easy. I'm just going to shut the window because I think ever since the restrictions relaxed, it's really noisy on the road. All right. Yeah, so this is kind of where we left with assignment 2 last week, where we had we'd done a whole bunch of DOM manipulation stuff and we toggled home and register and everything else. So let's actually start from there. Now remember, when you do get your assignment set up, you pretty much always want to go and start the back end is usually a good course of action, right? Yarn start on the back end. That'll start your back end up. I just realized that wasn't on the right screen. There's your back end. And then we'll start our front end up as well, right? 6080 front end, yarn start. Oh, actually, not yarn start, sorry. npx http server -p3000. I don't normally use this. I normally use Python for these things. But it's all the same. Great. So now we got our front end running on localhost 3000. Easy. So let's talk about promises. I'm not sure how many people we have here who actually left posts on the forum. Probably a couple, but we can still get started. So we had this kind of register screen before with like an ABC where you could register with that user. And one kind of key thing you'll see from last week was this whole idea where, say, let's just look at the register for a second, because you can see here that on the register button, we would fetch something, get a response, do all of this and then get channels. But again, let's take the get channels part out for a minute here. Let's just make it like a little less complicated because we should probably pull this get channels thing into its own separate function anyway, just to be a little bit clearer. So we can just kind of keep it to like, all right, well, on our registers click, we got to get email, password, name. Then we got to get our JSON string, which is what we're sending. We get our headers, and then we make that request. Now, again, I'm just going to clean this up a little bit more because I understand this is a lot of code and can be a little bit hard to read sometimes. So, you know, that's the crux of it. We have our fetch there. And the fetch call stuff. Now, one thing that a few students have discovered, either themselves or through tutorials, is the idea of promise chaining generally. So if you aren't very comfortable with promises, what I would suggest is you do go watch the week 5 tutorial recording, because I did go through a lot of stuff in that tutorial recording. But just to recap a few key things here, if I've got this fetch here where I'm saying I want to fetch this URL with these options, one common way that we write promises and interact with promises is by putting the dot then and the dot catch on subsequent lines underneath it. Sometimes you indent it, sometimes you don't. I don't think there's a particular style that really matters here. But it's like, you know, this is the format where you kind of will just do something like this. You'll say, yep, there's my promise. When I call dot then on that promise, I am telling it I want you to go and execute that promise. And when that promise resolves, I would like you to call this function I provided. And that function takes in a response object. However, if there's an error thrown in that at any point, we'll simply catch it and print out error in registration, and then we'll print out the error itself like this. You know, so we reload the page. We should have something similar. I'll open up the console, register 400. Okay, please enter valid details. So in this case, that fetch succeeded. That promise returned. We got that response here. The response status was 400, so he said, please enter valid details. It's probably because we've already registered. I register again. We're still getting please enter valid details. That's not good. Wonder why that is. What have we done wrong here? Well, you can tell this stuff actually by... yeah, let's have a look at the response object. So when we actually hear back from the console log, let's actually print out the response object and just take a look at it, see if there's anything useful here. So okay, we got our 400. There's a body there apparently, which is also a readable stream. So what did we learn about the other thing? We learned that on response, we have a readable stream that we can collect by, if the status is 400, I could say response.text, because .text itself is a promise that we can .then and get the data. And we can console log that data. And this will actually give us the result of what happened. Email address is already registered. Oh, of course, we've got to change the email. There you go. Now we signed up successfully. So the first question before we get into the channel stuff, because we will get into the channel stuff. For now, I'll just console log the token. I just want to ask all of you, it's like, so do you find anything confusing about promises beyond... Yeah, do you find anything confusing about promises at all? Because there's a thing to talk about here, which is the whole, you know, how do we deal with nested promises being so ugly? How do we make these things be a bit cleaner with chaining, which I know half of you are familiar with anyway. But are there any other kind of gripes or confusions or other stuff that comes up when you try and interact with promises? Is there anything that makes you scratch your head and think, this doesn't make sense? Just give you another 5 or 10 seconds. All right, everyone's way too comfortable. That's good. So maybe let me just jump into promise chaining then, because that continues to be a question that comes up. So if we ignore this. Yeah, we don't even need to ignore the status code part. One thing that happens a lot with promises, as you've seen in the last lecture, is you call a promise, and the result of a promise you need to call another promise, and then the result of that promise you need to call another promise. Right? Now that's not ideal, because you can see we've kind of done this here where we're like, all right, response.text.then and stuff like this. What we often like to do is actually chain promises. Like, so instead of a structure where we say, you know, like promise dot then something like this, and then inside of here we say d dot, you know, promise dot then, you know, this is what we would call like promise nesting. When, you know, here we'd say like e dot promise and, you know, dot then f, and it would just get deeper and deeper like that. Well, we can also do in instances like this, because in these instances too, you'd actually probably start to need a catch in every point as well. So rather than ending up in a situation like this, what we want to do is use promise chaining. And what promise chaining says is that, you know what, if you actually just simply return a promise as part of your dot then, like this, then you can actually just chain these things one after another. So in this case here, we call a promise, we then it. Once it's resolved, we capture what it resolved with, and then on some object on that, we make another promise inside of that. Well, let's actually just do them one after another now. So we can actually start doing something like this, where we say, you know, D, and once D's done, we want to return another promise, and once this promise is done, we'll capture the result of that with E, and then we'll return the next promise we want to call, and then when that one's done, we'll capture the next thing, and then when it's done, maybe we can finally console log the final result, like this. Now, what are the benefits of like an approach like this? Well, a couple of things. One is that with an approach like this, it's obviously cleaner to read, you know? That's definitely a lot cleaner to read. The downside, well, the other part that's useful is that you only have to have one catch, because the way catch works is that the catch is for catching any errors that are thrown within the then immediately. So it's like here, if you throw an error inside of this then, inside of this block, but you don't catch it here, the one on the outside is not going to catch it for you. Whereas when you promise chain, they're all kind of part of one big process. So like if you throw an error here, or an error here, or an error here, they will all get caught by the same thing. So if this one succeeds, fine. And then this one fails, it'll immediately go to the catch and it'll just be like, no, there's an error. Someone's just posted on the forum and said they can't find a link to the lecture this week. I thought it was relatively obvious. They're looking on the wrong page. Okay, I don't understand. Sorry, let me just post that link to them. Sweet souls. Okay, so that's the gist of promise chaining. Now immediately we could go back up to our code here and try and do something similar. Because what you can see is, let's actually just have a look at, say, the response status 200 part, because that's the part where we know it worked. You can see here that what we were doing previously is that we were actually getting the response, and we were making this, and we were doing another promise on that. Because remember that response.json, and this is how you have to think about it, what this returns is a promise, and you can look this up in the library, response object fetch API, and it will tell you exactly what it does. The .json method returns a promise that resolves with the result of parsing the body with, you know, as JSON. So when you just have this, if you were to just print this, what that value is, it would be a promise. Not the result of a promise, not even like the execution of a promise, just the fact that it's like a promise ready to go. A promise is essentially an asynchronous behavior that's just waiting to be executed. So it's sitting here waiting. And I could break this up too. I could say, you know, promise equals that. And then I could say promise dot then. And the dot then is actually what invokes it. So it's what actually invokes the promise and says, hey, you go away and do that asynchronous action, and when you're done, come call me here. And it's like, okay. But this is the nesting problem we have. So what we might do instead of actually dealing with that there, let's actually just return promise, and let's move our dot then down here. Because when we return the promise here, it's returning it within this function, because remember that this here is a function. It's got a parameters and it's got a body. So when I return it here, the function inside the dot then returns with a promise. And if the dot then returns with a promise, it will try and call another dot then if it exists. So it then moves down to the next dot then, like this. And this can immediately start to clean up your code, because now when I do E, it still all works fine. But now it's a little bit more manageable, right? In fact, again, we don't even need this return promise. We can just return this straight away. You know, that's a lot cleaner even in itself. There's our token. right? We're returning our token. We've captured our token with even less effort. Now, Sam says using fetch inside for each is a bad practice. Not strictly, no. Maybe I'll have a look at that with you in a sec. One says the 400 response is not going to catch directly. I have to throw it so it can catch it. Yeah, so let's actually use this example because I think this ties into the second thing I want to talk about, which is how do you actually write your own promises and deal with these kinds of things? So let's just say for a second, let's write our own utility. Okay, and this is something you can totally copy from this lecture. I'm not going to give you the code. I'd like you to write it out yourself if you're going to do it. But, you know, you could pay a friend to scribe it, I guess. But let's actually write ourselves utility, because what you'll probably start to notice in this entire, like, you know, assignment is that you're doing a lot of the same stuff. You're making lots of fetches, you're making lots of gets, you're doing all of this and whatever. So let's actually up here create our own little function, and I'll call it, let's call it just post request, or request post, or fetch post. Make your own function. Now what will this do? Well, this will do kind of a very similar thing to what this does, and I'll just like copy and paste it. And what I mean by that is that, well, it's going to be a post method. It's going to be content type application / JSON, because that's everything in the assignment. Okay, cool. It's going to have a body, but what's the body going to be? Well, the body will be variable, so I'll probably have to pass this in, body. Okay, so that'll have to be given to me by whoever's calling this function. Right. Okay, then I'm going to do a fetch, but my fetch is going to call localhost 5000. Well, it's always going to be the same URL, so I'll leave that here for now, and I'll just extract out the actual, like, the next part of the URL. So I'll say, like, you know, path here, and then I'll pull that out up the top as well. And it's like, okay, well, there you go. Now I've abstracted that out. I think you can ignore this red line here. I don't think it... Why is that misbehaving? I don't know. Let's actually make this like a little bit cleaner. It's usually good practice to try and use the backquote syntax. I think, I'm not sure why this is complaining. I feel like it's not a real... I don't know why it's assuming that bodies... Oh, what? Don't know. Someone else might figure that out for me. It's fine, we'll figure... Okay. Yeah, I didn't think it was a problem. Anyway, so we have our request options, which we always know are going to be post. They're always going to be JSON. We're going to have to pass in some body that's stringified, and then we call localhost 5000, and then that path. It's like, okay, well, what are we going to do after that? Well, we're going to capture a response. Now, what do you know about these responses? They're typically going to return you either a 403 or a 400. Okay, so now you say, well, I'm either going to return response.stat. If the response status is 400, then I would like to get the text, and then I would like to say, do something standard, like, you know, alert error message. And if the response is something else, right? Like if the response is 403, then I want to give the same error message. In fact, because you're going to do the exact same thing, why don't you just, you know, say or it equals 403, right? We could start with that. You could make that more interesting if you want to. Okay, cool. Great. And then if the response is 200, we want to do something. And it's like, well, what do we want to do? Well, I want to do something with the response object. So I want to take the JSON that I get back, and then I want to do like a .then on it, because it's a promise. I have to wait till it's done. And when it's done, I'm going to get the data from the JSON, and then I would like to call my success function and give it that data. So now we're talking about callbacks. So if I come up to this fetch post parameter list here and I add this in, what this means is that we've now created a function where what this function does, if we step through it, is that it takes in a path, takes in a body, sends that body to that path. It captures the response. If it's a 400 or 403, it simply decodes the text and alerts us. If it's a 200, we decode the JSON, and then once that promise is resolved, we take the data and we call a success function. Cool. So what that means is now I can replace a lot of what I have here, all this fetch and stuff I've done. I can just replace it with my function here, fetch post, where I give it the path, which is going to be auth/register. I give it my body, which is going to be just this, right? I'll call this body. I can get rid of all this other stuff now because it's all abstracted away in my function. I give it my body, and then I give it my success function. What do I want to do when it succeeds? So I'll do that here. I can put it here first. I'll call it success equals a function that takes in data, and all it's going to do is console log data token, right? Because that's what we want to get from the response object. Yep. Cool, and that's it. I can just pass in my success there. Okay, let's see if this works. Refresh this page. Get rid of all the stuff at the bottom. Refresh this. Alert, error, email address is already registered. Oh, so you think, oh, okay, that's right. The backend gives me this nice little JSON format. So it doesn't actually give it to me in text here, does it? I think it gives it to me in JSON. So it's like, well, we need to decode that anyway. So let's decode the JSON and then let's print it out. So instead of it being text, because remember, everything that's sent from the backend is text, it's just in a JSON format. And using the .json is just an easy way to decode, to get the text from the stream and to convert it to an actual object. So now when I do this, it prints object, and that makes sense because you saw before it was a simple like dictionary/object where I needed to do that, and now it will give me the error. Okay, so I've done that. That's quite clean. If I do it successfully, I get my token. Cool. This is really useful because I can use this post route now for something else. So let's say I want to have a register and a login. All right, so let me change the name of some of these things up here. Instead of saying about, I'm just going to have a register page, and instead of saying home, I'm just going to have a login page like this. Right, so now we're going to have two pages on our website, one register and one home. And I'll go back to my HTML and I'll change home to login, and I'll change this to register. So we've got our like login and our register screen. And I'll change all these names around to be consistent with that too. Now what am I going to do here? My login page doesn't need all of that. My register page will need all of that though. So I've got register, blah, blah, blah. And then my login page just needs email and password, right? Because when someone logs in, you don't need to enter their name. And I just need to change this here to be like login as well. So now we've got like a login and a register page. And let's try it out on my site. Okay, well you can see they're both visible there at the same time. That makes sense because I forgot to update my CSS. Right, because I have CSS in this provided file that hides things, I believe, or how did I hide it? Maybe I had it by default, display none or something. Okay, so I've got my login and my register, and then I can toggle between those screens pretty easily like this. Actually, fun fact, why don't we make one of those bold? That would be good UI. In fact, let's add a line here so it's really obvious what's happening. Okay, well, how do I make one of these bold? Well, you can see we've got two IDs here, and we know that the default one's always going to be login, so we can make that bold by default, like this, nice and easy. Okay, so then how do we toggle that? Well, when someone clicks on register, I'd actually really like the page login register style font weight to be bold, because I clicked on register, and I'd really like the login one to be default. I don't want it to be bold anymore. And similarly, when someone clicks login, I want to do the same thing but the other way around. I want to make the login bold and I want to make the register default. Okay, kind of worked. I probably got the default thing wrong here. I think font weight normal is the right one. I was just too scared to try it out. Yep. And you notice the other weird thing here from a UI perspective is that the cursor's like weird. It should not be a cursor, it should be a pointer. Oh wait, sorry, it shouldn't be a typey thing, it should be a cursor. So it's like now I can just add this to my CSS, where if I go back here and I look at my nav, let's just make everything inside the nav have a pointer. So I can say, you know, on hover for all elements inside my nav, let's make the cursor a pointer. The pointer's the little clicky thing. Okay, that looks better. Cool. So now I've got my two little pages. The cool thing about abstracting your own little fetch post thing is that now when someone wants to log in, I can reuse a lot of the same code. I can actually come down here and say, you know what? When someone goes to log in, let's actually just reuse the email and password, and let's just call, instead of auth register, let's just call auth login, and let's capture the token from response. Now, one thing you obviously have to be careful of here is that I've named these things the same thing. So I probably do have to update these fields to like, you know, email login and password login like this, you know, and email register, password register, and name register, because remember in HTML, you know, elements can only be named once with an ID. So this should still behave fine. If I go and try and play this out again, it's like, all right, I logged in. That's great. If I try and log in with a U, because there's no user, I get an error, invalid email or password. Immediately, you're starting to actually build out capabilities very, very efficiently, which is super exciting. Well, I think it's exciting. I hope you think it's exciting too. So you have something like this, but here's one of the downsides of like what you've done with this fetch post thing, which is that callbacks are not very scalable entities, right? Callbacks are like, okay, they're fine, but it's much better to deal with things as promises, because promises are equipped to deal with errors. They're equipped to deal with other things. So the current way I've structured this is not using a promise. My fetch post takes a callback. Callbacks are an idea that's been built into JavaScript since day one. Promises are a new feature that came out, I don't know, 10 years ago or something. So how do I actually turn this into a promise? Because you know it would be a lot better than this, because rather than have to do this funky little thing here where I say like, oh, you know, register success, like that, instead of doing that, it would be really cool to actually use the promise syntax, where this actually returned a promise, and then I could .then it. Like that. And then I could chain things together. Right? I could actually start chaining these things together. Now, this won't work out of the box. If I try this, I'll just get an error. And I'll get an error because we've just tried to call .then on something that's undefined. Why is that undefined? Because a function like this doesn't return anything. It just doesn't return anything at all. It returns nothing. Well, I could get around that. I could return my fetch, because when you return the fetch, which is a promise, it will return you whatever the .then returns. You know what I mean? Like what we did before. And then you could probably return this here. And you could just return the data, I guess. Like this would probably still work fine. I think that seems to work. That seems to work, right? So now we've kind of made it a promise by returning it, because fetch is a promise. However, while this works, there might be some time when you're writing your code where you actually need to do something even more interesting than this, where maybe you need to, you know, you want to do something more custom, which you just kind of can't really do by doing this. I don't have a great example off the top of my head, but let me just show you how to make your own promise out of something, because I think that's really important. And again, I went through this in my tutorial this week. So if you've got a situation like this where you have a body, you have a function, and you want it to return a promise, because if this returns a promise, you can .then it, and if you can .then it, you can do some fun stuff with it. So how do I do that? Well, all promises come in the same format, which is return new promise, like that. You create a new promise and you return it. What it takes in is a function with two parameters, resolve and reject, and a body. And at some point in this body, you have to call either resolve or reject. Now, the structure of promises is a little bit confusing, but you kind of get used to it. And the idea here is that when you return a promise, what this promise is it's this asynchronous function that will run, and when it's done, it will call either resolve or reject when it's happy. So if I take all my code here, for instance, all of this stuff, and I move it up into my promise, what will happen now? Well, if I run this, let's try it out. If I open this code and I click login, well, login's still... Now let me get rid of the success function mumbo jumbo. That's why it's working. Or register, I should say. If I call this, I get emails already registered. Now this makes sense because I've returned a promise from my fetch post, which is why it succeeds, and it actually calls the, like, when I call the .then on it, it says, yep, I can call a .then on a promise. Great, I'll go away and execute what's in this promise for you. Right, in this case it was an error. What happens if I try and create a new user? I click Z, but nothing actually seems to happen here. Is the network request frozen? Like, no. What's actually happening is that when I did the .then on this promise, and this is a promise because it's what the function returned, this promise ran, but it never really, like, even though it finished, it didn't do anything once it finished. Because the way promises are written is they don't finish by returning or anything like that. They finish by calling the resolve or the reject function. And it's like, what is the resolve or the reject function? The resolve or the reject function is actually the .then and the .catch. So you'll see here, and I'll show you this really easily. If we have something like this, I'm just going to console log data here and here, and I'll call this one then, and I'll call this one catch. If I just randomly was to put something in my code here where I just said resolve hello, like that, let's watch what would happen. We get the alert, well, we get the alert still, but it says then hello. So resolving is actually, like, the resolve is literally calling the function that is passed into the .then. That is all it is doing. It is just calling that function. And if I call reject here, it's just literally calling the catch. And that's how promises are designed. So when we say to you things like, oh, fetch is a promise, all we're really saying is that fetch is a function out there that just literally looks like this. And if you give it something bad, it just calls the reject function that it's given. And if you do well, it calls the resolve function that it's given. And that's how promises kind of give you back control. Because promises are asynchronous code that when they're done, they say, I'm done, I'm fulfilled, let's keep going. And that happens through the call of reject or resolve. So here's what we might do to make this our own custom promise. If there's an error, 400 or 403, I'm actually going to call reject. What this will do is this will send it to the catch of whatever I'm calling. Maybe you want to do this, maybe you don't. And if things succeed, I'm going to call the resolve with the data. Now I don't need the success function here anymore because I'm not passing in a function. I'm just returning a promise, and when the promise is done, it's down here that I give it the next function. So now this code should work quite elegantly. Okay, catch, well, I don't need that catch there. Yep, email address is already registered. ZZ, there's the token. YY, there's a different token. A, email address is already registered. Right, so now you've got this nice little uniform thing, and you can just, again, keep applying this down here. So you could say, yep, fetch post dot then. When we're done, I want you to go and collect me the data token. Easy. There you go. Now you could reuse this. You could use this for other stuff. In fact, you could make this a get function. You know, so like a common question, you know, people might have is like, oh, Hayden, what happens if I need like a get function here? Because I get it, you're doing 2 post requests, but I have this get channels thing up here where I want to call get channels, or let's get a specific channel. Let's look it up on the back end. How do we get a specific channel? And let's look up what channels actually exist in our back end as well. Database.json. What do we got down here? Channels. Okay, we got 747.890. Hopefully there's, oh, is there only one channel? Scat. Let's make another one. Let's just edit this. Why not? Yeah, we'll call this one like 89. You can edit your database like this if you want to. That's totally fine. You probably need to restart your server. Yeah, you probably need to restart your server. Don't do this unless you're comfortable with JSON, but it's like, okay, so here's my 2 channels. So let's say I want to pull one of these channels now, right? So again, it's like, all right, after someone logs in or registers, let's say in both cases, I would really like it if I could store the token. Maybe I should do that first. Let's try and do that one. So in both cases here, I'm going to get the token and I'm going to pass it into a function called, I'm going to call store token, data token, like that. Okay, let's try that. So when I log in and I register, I'd really like to store my token. So I'm going to make another function, store token. Now, where am I going to store that token? Well, hell, let's just store it in a global variable. Call it like token equals empty string, null. Undefined, it's all the same. Well, it's not the same, but it's all okay. So, I've got this function here that's going to take in the token, and all I'm going to do is set token equals token. There you go. That's all that function really does. And again, you could clean this up here by, instead of having this, you could actually just say, data equals store token like that. You could just do that and keep it even simpler. Yep, so there you go. You store your token like this. And then after you store your token, which isn't really a promise, so you probably don't need to .then it actually. Maybe I'll just undo what I did. Yeah. Undo what I did for a sec. So after I store my token, maybe I want to get some channel details. So I will call screw it. I'll just fetch it directly. Let's just fetch post. We'll have to change this to get. I want to fetch, what is it? It's channel / the ID of the channel. What do we agree the channel was? 747.889. Yep, so I want to fetch that. Great. It's going to be... what's the next argument again? The body. Alright, well what body does it need? It doesn't seem like it needs a body. It just wants that in the path. That's totally okay. So I guess we can just leave this as blank. We could probably just not even pass that in. Or you could pass it in as blank too. That's like all totally fine. Any of those things is good. So you do that. Great. And then you want to get the result. So let's actually just try and console log the data and see what happens. Now, I can't call this with a get because it's a freaking post method. So you'll see here, if I try and do this, we're going to get a big fat error. So I got to call register. ZZZ. Assignment to const variable. Oh, that's because this can't be const. Silly. Okay. 555, register. Okay, 404 not found. There is no route channel / that. Okay. I'm surprised that's a 404 and not a 405. Because remember, 405 errors are when you call the right route but you have the wrong method, which tells me we might have done something wrong. But anyway, it's not a post thing anyway. So what we need to do in this case here is we need to call it with get. So how would you do this with get? Well, you could obviously copy and paste this entire thing, right? You could be like, yeah, I'm going to go get all this and we'll make like a fetch get. And what's the difference with a get? Well, it doesn't have a body. It just has like URL parameters, but we'll forget about those for a second because that's harder. So we'll get rid of the body. Okay, its headers are application JSON, sure. Its methods get, great. But the rest of this seems the same. Okay, so we just create fetch get there. Right, and I'll just call fetch get. And let's see if this works. Let's see what I've done wrong here. Okay, 403 forbidden. Why is this forbidden? Because I'm not passing the token in. I need to pass that token into one of the headers. And you think, oh, okay, well, what's my fetch get here missing? Well, both of them are missing something to do with headers, right? Because I might also have some kind of bearer header. So like what I probably need here in my fetch post as well, just to future-proof it a little bit, is I can pass in, or hell, I mean, okay. You could pass in the token, or if you want to be really kind of clumsy, you could, actually no, you should pass in like the token, something like this, right? And what I'll do is I'll say if token is present, right? If token, well, yep, if token is not null, then I want to add to request options dot headers. I want to set authorization to be bearer and then my token, like that. Yeah, something like this. And now my fetch post, or maybe I should put this after the body. I don't know. Let's leave it in this argument. I'm going to have to adjust my fetch post now to maybe pass in null here instead, like that. So both of these will pass in null. Then I have to do the exact same thing for my get. Oh, okay, well, let's just copy it. Let's just copy this whole thing here. There we go. Get rid of the body. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, so now if we pass in the token, it should be fine. So when I call this fetch get, I'm going to pass in my token as well. Try this. Token is not defined. What's the problem now? I forgot to update my fetch get. So let's take a step back here and be like, you know, this fetch get thing's kind of annoying because you can see I'm already forgetting stuff and we're trying to maintain two different functions that are basically the same. You know, they like really are basically the same. It's giving me a 4.0. 747.889. Huh, I wonder why that's not working. That's really weird. So just before we dig much deeper on this, let's actually say, well, how would we generalize this even more if we wanted to? Well, I don't like this fetch, post, fetch, get thing, so let's just have one function. Let's just call it fetch. You know what? Screw it. Let's just pass in the method at the start. It can be, you know, it can be post, get, whatever. So we'll just have our own fetch. We'll call it my fetch. Now I'm not saying that it's a good idea to always rewrite all these abstractions, because obviously in many cases you can just use fetch. Though in some cases it's good to kind of make a wrapper around it. So you might call like API fetch or something like this, or you know, Slacker fetch or whatever. So let's call it API fetch, and I'll get rid of this get here, and let's just use the same one for everything. So my fetch down here, I'll just call this fetch. I'll say that it's, you know, it's of type post. Great. I've got another one down here, API fetch. It's of type post. Perfect. Then I have my other fetch here. This one's of type get. Okay. Nice and simple. This should work for us, hopefully. Let's try it out. Log in. Oops. Sorry, I think I meant this is the wrong stuff. I don't know why the login didn't work though. Login should have worked. Okay, so why is nothing happening here? I'm clicking login and nothing's happening. We can look at the network tab. Okay, let's have a look at the network tab. Refresh, click login. Okay, well, we're making the request, so that's a good sign. So that tells me that the fetch is working. Maybe I'm just not resolving it correctly, or maybe I'm not calling reject or something here. Let's have a look at who's calling these methods. All right, well, we have the dot then. We have the API fetch here and the dot then. So let's put some, you know, some console logs down. Put an A console log here, put a B console, we'll put a B console log there. You can find things pretty quickly. Okay, so we are getting there. We are storing the token. Just turns out I wasn't doing anything with it. So I was being very boring. So everything was working totally fine. So let's try and get this channel loaded now. AZ. Register. Okay, authorized user is not a member of the channel. Okay, so this is working, but it's not liking it because I'm not a member of that channel. Okay, well, that's annoying, but maybe let's just modify... maybe let's just modify this a little bit. And also, let's stop using register to test, because that's kind of annoying, because we have to, you know, make a new account every time. So let's use login. And the login we'll use is the username A, because we know that the username A here, there it is, email A. So this is our user. You can see this in the database. The person with email A is that user. So when I go down to my channel here, my 747.889, I can actually just add another member like that, and I'll restart the server. Again, you can just call the API. You can do this manually. You can call it through Swagger. I'm just lazy, and I find that quicker to do. So now when I log in with A, I actually get the channel details. Because if you step through what's happened here, we've posted to log in. We've gone and got the fetch for the get. And then it's like, cool, we've gotten the data for the channel. Great. Easy. Now, a question that might come up is, how do we, let's say there's a bunch of channels. You know, I've got channel 1 here and I've got channel 2 here. You know, let's make another random channel called public channel 3, which has a slightly different ID. And let's say now what we're going to do is after someone logs in, let's actually collect all the details of all the channels. I'm not saying you want to do this. I'm just saying, you know, let's try it out. So I know that once they, you know, once they log in, I've got the channel details. So instead of calling a specific channel, let's actually go get a list of channels, because we know we can do that, right? So /channel gives us a list of channels. Now again, because I'm writing these nice little mini utility pieces of code, I can expand this very quickly here. So I can comment this out and say, all right, after we store the token, let's call API fetch for get for /channel. We'll pass in the token, and then we'll get the response. Let's get all the data and console log that data. And let's see what we get. Log in. Oops, don't need that slash. Okay, channels 2. I've got 2 channels in my array. I'm missing one. Maybe it's because I didn't restart the server? I should have 3. 2. Oh, forgot to add myself to this one. What happened? Oh, yeah, I think this happens if you if you modify the database and then you make an HTTP request before you restart the server, the database will override it. Because what the database does, it's actually got a store of all of this in memory right now. It's actually sitting there in memory. And when you do any kind of HTTP request, it goes and like dumps what it has in memory in the file. So like basically, if you do ever want to modify this directly, you just need to save it, restart it, and then you should be fine. And you'll see this one will work now. Login 3. Lil Nako says, to get the name of each member to display in the invite to channel section, you need to make a fetch call for each member. Is there a more efficient way? So there are parts of this assignment where the only way to get information is to make a whole bunch of fetches. We do that by design because in reality, sometimes you can't avoid that. Better APIs will have ways around that for you, but sometimes it's not avoidable, and knowing how to manage that's like an important piece of understanding. So I've got my 3 channels here, and you can see the only information I have with them is like their IDs, the members and stuff. But what if I want more information than that? You know, what if I want to get, say, well, that's actually most of the information. But let's say I want to get like all the messages in these channels for some reason. Let's say I want to count all the messages that exist. Let's try that. Let's just alert all the messages that exist in this application, and I'll just stub a few more here. Call this message like 105, and I'll call this message like 100 and something something something. I got to get rid of these commas. Okay, let's see if this works. Yep. So I want to count up all the messages. So now my data here is a list. Invalid email. Oh no, I scared it. I think if you modify this incorrectly, it'll panic. So what the server does is that if it sees an error, the error's from this comma here. If you input this incorrectly, it will just destroy it, because it sees an error and it's like, no, I'm out, I'm restarting everything. So this should work. Yeah, so I got my 3 things here. So let's loop through it, all right? So what I know, I've got my const channels equals data channels. Okay, great. And then I can loop over that. Const, what do I want inside of that? ID of channels. This should console log me all the IDs, I think. Yep, there's all the IDs. So this is saying get that particular part of the return dictionary, then loop over every item and extract just the ID component of the dictionary. If I didn't have this here, it would just pull each component and you get the whole JSON blob, right? So you get the whole blob, whereas when I do this, I'm saying, yeah, I get that it's an object, just give me the ID, please. So that's what I want to do there. George says, I take it there's no way to get a single message without fetching 25 messages at once. That's correct. There's some inefficiencies in the API. That's mostly by design, and that's okay. That's a relatively contained assignment. So now let's actually, what we want to do is we want to go loop over all the channels, right? Now, if I've got my list of channels here, I can do something like this where I, now I go and say like, I fetch it. Or alternatively, I could use the JavaScript map function here. So I could say data channels dot map. And what this will do is the arguments I give map here, for instance, will be all the info for a particular channel. And then within that, I can do something like, I could actually, console log channel here, like that. So this is immediately a little bit cleaner. Right? Oops. Silly me. This is immediately a little bit cleaner. But again, I could actually pull out the ID. So I could say ID, like that. And that'll get me the ID immediately. I think you need the brackets when you destructure like that. I do think they're necessary. Great. Moon says, this is probably a silly question, but we can have multiple JavaScript files, right? Yeah, definitely. You can have as many as you want. Break it up as much as you want. That's totally up to you. It's no right or wrong way to do that. So now that I've got this, how do I make all of these requests? Well, I could just use my fetch again. I could say API fetch, get channel / and I'll give it the ID. So we'll use the back quotes here. Channel / ID, and I need to give it the token, and there's no body. So yep, and then it's like a dot then, and then I'm gonna get my response here. I'll call this like channel info, and then I'll console log that like this, and let's see what we get. Okay, so we got the data. Now what do we want from this? We want the length of the... Is there a separate one for messages? Or am I just not looking at it? Oh, sorry. Derp. Get this channel's messages. My bad. That's what I was looking for. Sorry. Okay, so let's call this one. We got message / ID. We passed in the token. We got the channel ID in the URL. But you see here, it wants something else in the URL, which is the query. It's like the start index. Now, this is more complicated, but like I'm just going to say start equals 0 here because the server might want it. You can figure out how to make that a little bit cleaner if you'd like to, but that's hopefully what I want here. So let's try that. Okay, so I've got my 3 arrays. So I can get the length of these arrays. I can get the length. Sorry, I'm writing Python. Channel info messages dot length. So now I get the 3 lengths of those things. Cool, 1, 1, and 25. How do I add all of these up? All right, well, I could make a variable here called like message sum equals 0. And then I'll just increment that. Message sum plus equals the length of it. And then at the end, I'll just alert message sum. So that should work fine, right? It's like, no, it won't. I'm going to get 0. And the reason this happens, right, is because you understand how asynchronicity and promises work by now. This map, while it loops through it casually, all of these 3 things here are fetches. So I need to wait until 3 promises are done until I can actually like sum it up. And this one becomes a little bit challenging, right? Because it's like, oh, well, I know how to wait for 1 promise to be done, but you don't know what order these are going to process in, right? Like you just don't. Like if I go and get channel info here, like what channel info? It's probably going to have an ID or something. No, it doesn't. Well, we can look at Swagger. It tells us what we get. Oh, it's a list. Oh, it's the messages. Sorry. Yeah. That makes sense. Channel messages dot length. It's like you'll see this might be slightly different every time. 1125, 1125, 1125, 1125. Now in this case they're all the same. They're pretty reliably consistent. That kind of makes the example a little bit useless. But they might come in different orders because the way JavaScript works is it just sends out all 3 of these promises at once. That's one of the benefits of asynchronous programming is you don't have to wait for anything. It's just all sent out at once. How do you stop them all? Like, how do you wait until they're all done? Okay, so waiting till they're all done is, I don't remember this. It's like promise.all. One of the ways to do this is there's a promise.all function in JavaScript, which takes in a list of promises and it returns a single promise that resolves to an array when it's done. So what I mean by this is that let's actually create ourselves like a promise list up here. A list of promises. And every time we get a promise here, let's actually just push it into our list. Promise list.push. I'm actually just pushing the whole promise in there. Now is this gonna stop it from running? No, it's gonna run fine. It's just that previously API fetch used to return a promise, we just kind of did nothing with it. So now I've got this promise list and we can actually print that out. Let's actually print out our promise list. It's like, cool, great. Promise, promise, promise. Great. Now what this promise.all function does is when you give it this list of things, promise.all, and I give it my promise list, this promise.all itself returns a promise and it only resolves once they've all resolved. So if I .then this, and then I call this done, let's just see what it gives us, console.log done, what you'll see is that this is the result of waiting until all three of them have finished. So you see it actually did that. It went, 1, 2, 3, this, and then it gave me 3 lots of undefined. Why it gave me 3 lots of undefined is because whilst these were promises that we gave the promise list, all of these promises never returned anything. So if I just inside the end of my promise write return 5, it returns 5, 5, 5. So the promise.all will actually go and take this list of promises, capture all their return values, which, by the way, could be more promises. Not really, because they'll wait till they're done. I think. What's the difference between promise.resolve? I'm not going to get into that. So, now I'm actually just going to return the message length. Because that's what I was looking for, right? I just want the length, and now this will print it out for me. And it prints it out in one go, so I can actually sum these up now really easily. I could actually how do you sum an array in JavaScript? Sum list in JavaScript. Isn't there is it just reduce or? Yeah, I don't think there's a nicer way to do it. Yeah, it's not really super pretty, but I'll call this like the length list. Is you could take the length list and reduce it, as in, sum it all up. That's just a sum function. A little bit weird. If you don't know what that means, don't worry. You could do it the old school way. And I get 27. And you might think, oh god, that was a really painful way to go and figure all of that out. And it's like, yeah, it was a little bit painful, but you could make it a little bit nicer for yourself as well. Like, for example here, we've done some nested promises here too. So what you could actually do here is you don't need to do the .then on the API fetch. You could actually just return the API fetch and then simply on the next line here, do the next .then. Just like we did before, get into that promise chaining. And it's like, okay, cool. And then similarly here, what do we know? Promise.all returns a promise. So let's just return that. Because as long as the result of your .then is returning another promise, you can start chaining these things together. And now you'll get something closer to this. It's now I've got 27. And then you think, can we clean this up even further? Maybe. I don't know. You probably don't even need this .then, because the API fetch will actually return you a promise that's just the results anyway. So what I could try and do here, right, is... Let me get rid of this console log. Let's just console the list length list. You can see right now we get, 1, 1, and 25. Let's get rid of all this .then stuff. Let's just push the done API fetch to it. What do we get now? We get 3 lists which contain all of this stuff. So it's basically now we just get the message stuff. So this could actually make your code even easier, because you could actually think of this as all right, this one is getting all the messages. And then all you need to do here is do another reduce function, say, that takes in, this one might get a little bit weird, but yeah, let me show you this one quick, then we'll take a break. But here, you can see again, just the point is how kind of simple some of this stuff is here. Selena says, when you get the messages inside of each channel, are you doing nested promise requests? I wouldn't call these nested. It's that this is a promise that resolves, which returns another promise here that when you call .then that resolves, and then as part of this one there are three promises called that are all running loose, but this particular then returns another promise which is kind of like a wrapper for promises, where that promise won't return until these three ones have done. So it's like kind of like a, you know, like a mum dad equivalent promise that's like looking after children or something. It's like, hey, I'll just keep an eye on you, and yep, I'm done. And then you return that, and then like you get the messages here. Yeah. Now, when I've got these messages here, I could do a really simple thing. I could say messages.map, and I could map, you know, a message to like its messages.length or something, right? So this is an easy way to take like an object which has a key, and you want to get the length of that. So what you see is if I console log messages like this, and then I'll console log messages map, that's kind of how I can extract that out. So it's like I've just extracted that out, and then if I wanted to, if I console log the messages a map, and then I reduce this, like we saw before, that'll get me the sum. So, you know, you could actually, you know, there's your result. So you could say, you know, const sum equals that. There's your sum. And you're done, really. But, you know, that's the kind of thing you could do. You could break some of these up into functions and other kinds of things if you want. Musa said earlier, can we store the token in local storage? You can. That's totally fine. Easy. I hope I've answered all the questions so far. Let's take a 5-minute break. Come back at 7:14. And if you have any questions or other things you want me to run through, can you post them in the chat during the break? Because after the break, I'll do a quick explanation of await async very quickly. And then we'll finish up unless there are other questions to run through. So let's stick to that. Come back in 5 minutes. All right, welcome back from the break. We have one question come up over the break from Yuan, which says, for 2.3.7 pinning messages, can you give an example of what results are we expecting? I have no idea how it works with chat window. Well, it's totally up to you. So the idea of a pinned message is like, Ali snuck in there at the last minute. The idea of a pinned message is, you know, if you have like a screen like this, let's just say this is your random thing, right? And, you know, maybe you got your channels on the side here, and it looks like Slack or Teams. You got all your messages here. A pinned message is just a message that you can easily access. That's it. That's all the tutors are going to look for. So maybe it's always visible up the top. So maybe if you pin a message, it always sits up here with the other pinned messages. Maybe if you pin a message, there's a little box over here where when you click on it, there's a pop-up that appears that shows you all of the pinned messages. Like, there's no real strictness to it beyond what's in the spec, which is just like, it just needs to be a way where, if you imagine there's a theoretical example where there's 1,000,000 messages or 1,000 messages an hour coming through, how do you pin a message which makes it kind of easily accessible all the time? I hope that answers your question. If it doesn't, let me know. Ali says, if we re-render the page when a message has been reacted to, it disrupts the user's location on the page. I guess my question to you is, are you re-rendering it because you reacted to a message, or because another user reacted to a message and you're just kind of re-rendering it? Because if it's just you reacting to it, you don't, like, I get that you could re-render it. That's one easy way to get around it. But the expectation we kind of have is that you don't re-render the page, but you actually just like leave the content there, but update that particular DOM element for the React. Now, one of the reasons, again, that assignment 3 is on React.js and these declarative frameworks is that what you're doing is, if I'm understanding you correctly, is kind of a nicer way to program. It's a lot easier. And kind of trying to manage the DOM like we are directly is really painful. So ideally what we want to avoid is like, oh, I've updated something, refresh, get the fetch, get it all again, repaint it all again. Because it's easy to code, but it gives a terrible experience, like you've said. So the expectation is that when people do things like post a message, that you don't refetch all the messages, but you just add another message there. And then if you were to refresh the page, that you would actually get them all fresh again if you like logged in again and stuff. So there's like a little bit of tweaking in terms of just like making these little additions as you go. Once again, I hope that answers your question. If it doesn't, please let me know, and I'll do my best to help out. Okay. Well, I had a student. I hope that covers the questions that were asked in the forum. I do. So to I know who was it. It was like so to it's just loading slowly. I hope that answers the questions for people, whoever they were. I know who you are. I don't remember the specific names. But let's have a quick look at await async. So the thing about promises is that they were a really cool invention in JavaScript, but they're a bit cumbersome to work around. So what ended up happening was that people said, you know what, promises are really cool, and in fact you still use them all the time, particularly for things that are kind of concurrent, multi-threaded, stuff like this fetch here. You know, that's where like they're really useful for. But the thing is, more than half the time you're using promises, you only really are just trying to like do this thing, wait till it's done, do the next thing, wait till it's done, do like you're just like one after another, right? So in these cases where even though the work's behaving asynchronously, but you're kind of still working with it synchronously, we can use another type of syntax called await async. Now what I'm going to do here is I'll demonstrate this syntax to you. It's a little bit weird, but let me just copy and paste this so you have reference for what the old one looked like. And what await async does is that instead of saying something like, you know, fetch, you know, http/abc, you know, some object dot then data response dot, you know, response.json, and then like dot then json.console.log json or something like this. Instead of doing this, what you actually do is you do something like this. You say const response equals await fetch. And I just want to really reiterate this, because here's the thing about teaching. I'm going to say this to you, and I'm going to say it again at the end, and at least one of you is not going to listen. So like, it's not you. It's probably not you. If you're thinking, how, that's definitely not you then. But like, you cannot use await async in assignment 2. You can't use it. You can't use it at all. It's for assignment 3 only. We want you to avoid it so that we can test that you actually understand promises. You can't do anything I'm showing you from now until the end of the lecture. You can't do it. So this is what you would do instead, which you can't yet, is you do something like this, and then you say const JSON equals await response.json, and then you would say console log.json. Now, if you're looking at this and you're thinking that looks nice, it's like, well, it does look nice, but this is essentially a way where you can take asynchronous written JavaScript and write it as if you're writing in like a default synchronous language, like Python, right? This feels probably more natural to what many of your, you know, standard programming tendencies are. So this is the kind of thing you do. And await is simply a thing that says, take this promise, stop right here until it's done, and then whatever data you are going to give when I called the dot then, just give it to me now as a return object. That's all that's happening here. And same thing here. It's like, hey, get this promise, stop, halt the execution, because the code literally stops right here. It will not continue, it will not execute this next line until this one's done. And it's like, when you're done, instead of resolving to a dot then, just give it to me as a return value. And it's like, okay, great. So that's the premise of what the difference is. Now, we could try and go clean up our code to do this, right? So instead of like this, I could rewrite this. I might put this at the bottom just so it's out of the way, and you can kind of compare the two logins, right? Here I can say, instead of this, I'll say, you know what, const data equals API await API fetch, like this. Now, if you forget the await, it doesn't block. It doesn't do anything synchronously. Data just becomes a promise, and you've done nothing. So the await is the stop and wait until this is done. So I do that, and then what I'll do is I'll say store token, data token, And then I'll say, you know what, now that I've got the token, let's say const data2 equals API fetch. All right. And then, you know, we'll do the rest of this. Let blah, blah, blah. Blah, 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 blah. We have our message sum. We have our promise list. Now, you still actually have to use promises for this. I mean, actually, I might get around this for you. Let me show you this. Let's do it a different way. For const ID of data channels, await API fetch like this. And in fact, let's grab the return value. What was it? It was like message list or something. So we can actually just start storing a message list directly here, right? Dot push like this. There you go. I don't need any of my promise.all stuff. I don't need any of that. I'll just say, you know, I've got this message list, loop through it. There you go. That's it. That's how you'd use it with like await and await. Now, this will look more natural to a lot of you because it's again, it's written as if all blocking requests are blocking. It's very imperative. And this should behave fine, I think. Well, actually, there's probably going to be one error we get with it. Unexpected reserved word. That's not good. Is that what I think it is? Yeah, it's await. The one weird thing about await is that everything you await needs to be done inside a promise itself. And this is a little bit of a mind mess, but await can only happen inside a promise. So, in theory, what I kind of have to do here, sort of, is say that I don't know, like I could say new promise, resolve, reject, like this, and then I could say dot then and do nothing with it. You know, I just want to invoke it immediately. I just want to create a promise and invoke it. And then inside my promise, I'm just going to go do all this stuff. Now, I don't know if this will work or if... Surprised this isn't working. I thought browsers had await built into them. Maybe they don't. Oh no, I think it's okay. I don't know why it's not liking this. I'm surprised. So I'm surprised I'm getting this issue. Does await work in... What are we in? Edge? I don't know. JavaScript, how to use this in Chrome or Edge. Blah, blah, blah. Blah, blah. Ah, alright. Maybe it works in Chrome. Or maybe I'm just totally forgetting. Maybe I just... This is the whole transpilation issue where browsers might run older versions of code. Let me try in Chrome though. Nope. Okay. I've totally just mistaken that. It works in browsers. Okay. Sorry. My bad. Well, yeah, maybe it does, but the thing is that... So what... Okay, let me take you through what I was going to show you, because I've probably just made a mistake here. Is that the async keyword, which is what some of you are talking about, literally is just a promise wrapper. So if I do something, I'll show you this. If I have a function up here called a that takes in data, and all this does is return 6, right? The rule of await async is that you cannot await a promise. You cannot do what I'm doing here unless you are doing it inside of an asynced function. What that means is that to do something like this is not legal. If you try and do that, you'll get an error. To do something like this, it needs to be in a function that looks like this. Const b equals async data return 6. Now, this keyword async is not something you can just kind of gloss over. What it's actually doing is turning your function into a promise. So what this async keyword does in reality is it actually takes your function here and it does this for you roughly from memory. That's kind of what it does for you. And the reason this is important is because await is only really designed to happen within promises itself. So if I was to, you know, as part of this, I was to say something like await fetch, this can now work inside of here. You know, and JavaScript knows how to transpile this down into smaller stuff. So what's probably happening here is maybe, like I was trying to demonstrate to you that await needs to be in a promise, because it does. But in reality, you'd never actually wrap it in a promise like that. What you would actually do, and maybe I should have just jumped to this at the start, is you make the function that it's called in, which is this one up here, right? Because that's the function right there. You would make this one async. Let's see if this works. Maybe this works, and I was just doing it wrong. Okay, that did work. Great. Data.channels is not iterable. Oh, it's down here. Right, sorry. Wait, what? What's that error? Data.channels is not iterable. On what line of code is that happening on? Const ID. Oh, okay, sure. There we go. Data.channels. Well, that makes sense because I'm pretty sure... actually, it doesn't make sense. Let's console log that. Let's have a look at what that is. Data channels. Undefined. All right, well, what's happening here? Let's have a look at what data 2. I guess because I changed the variable name. Sorry. This will work. No, it won't. I'm missing the await. That's probably the next problem. Awaits can be very dangerous if you're missing like an await. All right, now that's still not working. Let me. I'm not actually printing anything. It's probably working fine. And I'm just not printing anything. 27. Okay. So awaits are a little bit cleaner. What this does mean though is that the function being called on the click will now technically not finish until the promise is done. So previously, without the async, it was just a normal function that would finish very quickly, and the promises would wander off over here. Whereas now that's not the case. Now, generally, await async is a cleaner method, you know. And Selena says, which is more popular? Await. Well, await and fetch are not the same thing. Await is just a method to avoid having to write out a lot of boilerplate for promises. Fetch is just like everything is still promises, right? Like this is still a promise. It's just you don't have to do the dot then stuff. It's kind of like saying await versus dot then. That's kind of the way up you'd have. The one downside of doing this though is if you get too comfortable with await and you don't understand promises, then you'll start writing code like this one. And this one is going to be slow. Because if you have like 30 channels, you're going to have to make 30 sequential requests that will go one after another. And in fact, Zane from Google does a good little lecture that I think he'll do in week 9, if he replies to my messages, which actually demonstrates this a bit more. But even if you're using await async, you would still set up a promise list like this and just use these ones as standard promises. You wouldn't await these. And then you would use promise.all here. But do you remember with promise.all, how what we used to do is we used to say like dot then, and then we would do more stuff here, right? Well, remember what await does is replaces the dot then. So what you can actually do here is say, actually, I'm going to get the message list by awaiting the promise.all. Because the code will freeze here until these 3 promises that are all running concurrently now will finish. And then we, again, should finish up with the same result. 27. So that's the await async part here. Lil Nako says, I know both work. Was that Selena's question? I'm a bit confused. Oh, sorry. No, I see your question. Is there a reason why I'm using data channels instead of data.channels? No, not really. I'm pretty sure both are valid in JavaScript. That's it's a weird habit I have, I guess, where if in my brain, if it's user defined, I tend to do the Python index and syntax, and if it's like system defined, I tend to use like, you know, like this syntax up here. I don't know why I do that. It's probably a bad idea. Yeah, that's about it. Both are fine. If they work, they work on that front. And Lil Nako says, do we only need to check for status 400 and 403? The only statuses you need to check for are the ones written in the API docs. You don't need to check for anything beyond that. So this pretty much brings us to the end of the things I had to go through tonight in relation to what people were asking around promise chaining and creating your own promises and other stuff. Like there was a question on the forum where someone was like, I think Samuel asked this question, and I just want to point out how this was answered. Samuel's question: is it possible to cover promises in more detail? How to write functions that use and return promises return values? Sam's like, I got this info, how do I do something with it? I hope it made sense that I've demonstrated that tonight, that we've like gone through that tonight. So fingers crossed that made sense to you. But yeah, beyond that, that's it. So I gave you the opportunity to ask questions, so I don't want to drag out everyone's time while I wait here for people to write in the chat. So let's wrap it up. Good luck with assignment 2. Because of Flex Week next week, we won't see each other until it's due. So for those of you who've started early, oh hey Sam, are you here? Cool. Oh, Samuel and Sam, I got that all mixed up. I hope that helped. I won't see you till it's due. I'll see you a couple days after it's due. So good luck with it. Me and Emily will be on the forum. Oh, it's not you. Why did you say it's me? Oh, you're right. Your last name's different. Damn it. Yeah, we'll be on the forum. We'll be there to help. There's a bunch of help sessions. Don't forget about the help sessions. If you go to some at busy times, don't be mad at the tutors. Have something to do. We have more tutors on during busier periods, right? Like here's the lead up to assignment 2 being due. It's like goes up, there's a lot of people around. More help sessions than pretty much any other level 6 course. Yeah. The last piece of advice I'd give before we wrap up about assignment 2, don't get caught up on the user interface and how it looks. I think it's a very big tendency I see students do where they will kind of like, they'll do something, they're like, oh, that doesn't look very good, and then you'll freak around with it for like 30 minutes, and like then you're just like kind of time lost. So get stuck into it. And last thing, sorry, while I'm rambling, is that I know there's kind of students that are like, oh my god, there's like so much work with this assignment. So I think something I really want to contextualize here, a few things. One is that we don't expect everyone to finish this assignment, right? And I always have this question every single year where it's like, how do you have assignments that like you don't expect everyone to finish? And it's like, the thing with this assignment is that you know exactly what you have to do. If you all finished it, you'd all get 100% or close to, right? It's a different kind of assignment. We could give you an assignment that you could finish but get wrong. It's not really like that. So like if you finish it, you've kind of got it right. Like it's pretty obvious. You're like, I can log in, check, there's my mark. It's nearly like you have auto markers as you go. Obviously you might miss something because you and a tutor have a different understanding, but they're going to be very few and far between. So that's number one. Number two is just around the assessment. Do remember too that this assessment is worth 30% of the course. It's nearly worth a third of the whole course. That's quite substantial because in other courses you'll do in CSE and across UNSW, remember that like the kind of assignments you'll do in week 5 and stuff might only be worth like 15, 10, 20% or something like this. So it does feel heavy because it's actually a lot of your marks. It's bigger than the exam. So like you're investing a lot of time into it because it's actually a big chunk of the course. The other thing we care about with this assignment is that it's at a good time of term compared to like crushing everyone in week 10. So most students, you'll find from what I've seen, the end of week 5 and week 6 are kind of probably, depending on when you start the assignment, might be some of the more challenging times for you in this course. That's kind of the hump from what we can see. And we try and time that hump with Flex Week a little bit so that people have a little bit of breathing room. Again, if you are struggling with it, just please pop into help sessions. Like, we're here to help. That's the main thing I want to stress to everyone is that, we design these courses to be fun and interesting, and we want to be as supportive as we can while still giving you a great opportunity to learn. So, we're here to help. We're here to help. That's what I said. If you're not using Bootstrap, you're probably going to be doing a lot of work. If you're not using Fetch, you're probably going to be doing a lot of work as well. If you're not using the tools, you're going to be doing a lot of work. That's not saying it's bad. It's just like if you're using these libraries and you're using these friendly things, it will be a lot better. And my last comment, just Sam Yang says, I didn't notice there was a 15% for responsive design for this assignment. My advice to you all is still the same thing. Build your app on the mobile setting. Because if you do it on the mobile setting and you think it's workable on the mobile setting, I guarantee you, you will have very little trouble making it work on tablet and desktop. It's so much easier to take a small page and make it bigger than it is to take a big page and make it smaller. So like if you haven't done this already, do start it. Just start thinking about this size first. That's if you care about those marks. If you don't care about it, don't bother, right? Like that's fine. Not everyone's going to get those marks, so don't waste your time on that kind of stuff. But if you do want them, start on this size. Start on like mobile, something like this. It doesn't really matter. 400 or whatever we said. Was it 400 by 700? Seems awfully big. I don't know. Okay, well, I'm going to wrap up there. As I said, if you need anything, let me know. I'm here to help. This course is my baby, so I want to make sure everyone's happy. Post on the forum. We'll be around. Have a great week. Stay safe, everyone. Look after yourselves and all of that. And yeah, I'll see you in 2 weeks. But you'll hear from me sooner. So have a good night.